Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Iván López. I'm from Madrid, from Spain. I hope you're enjoying the conference. Thank you all for being here after the amazing party we had yesterday. And today we're going to talk a little bit about open source. So I'm going to tell about explaining what is open source, a little bit of history. I'll talk a little bit about licenses, different ways to contribute to open source. And at the end, I'm also going to share you my own personal story. So we live in this planet, and at least for now, and we're here today, and the Tesla is on the space because of the open source. And open source is everywhere. We have it in our phones, in our laptops, in our watches, in our TVs. It's also in our fridge, in our cars now. And open source is everywhere. And open source is everywhere because open source is better. And open source is better for the same reason than science. It's better than alchemy. So this is the Apollo guidance computer that was used to put the man on the moon almost 50 years ago. The speed was around 2 megahertz. It has 4 kilobytes of RAM, and it weighs 32 kilograms. And today, we have in our pockets way more power than that computer. So we have phones with multiple cores, 4, 6, 8 gigabytes of RAM, and as I said, way more power than the computer used to put the man on the moon 50 years ago. And in case you're wondering, the code of the Apollo guidance computer is now open source. You can look it on Google. It's on GitHub now. So I said open source a few times, but what is open source? So open source is the term that we use to describe the software that is distributed and developed with its source code made available, and that can be used and modified because it's been designed to be publicly accessible. Making things following an open source philosophy can have a great impact in the world because it promotes things like interchange of ideas. And allowing people to use the information that already exists with freedom, it's what makes civilization grows. And on the other side, we had the proprietary source on the proprietary software. So every time we talk about open source, there are quite a few myths around open source. So let's talk a little bit about a few of them. The first one is that it's free, right? And the problem is that in English we have the word free, that can be as in freedom, but also can be free as in no cost, as gratis, right? And that's the problem with the word. But open source doesn't need to be free as in no cost, right? So you can pay for open source, and not all the open source needs to be free. Another myth is that open source is not reliable and is not supported. I'm pretty sure that you know companies like Canonical or Red Hat. They are very big companies. And they use open source every day, and they support open source, right? Canonical is behind Ubuntu. Red Hat, everyone knows Red Hat, right? Linux distribution, servers. They have a lot of tools. They are open source, and they make money, and they support that open source software. Another myth is that about security. So people say that if you can see the source code, there will be more security issues. And for me, it's just the opposite. The fact that you can see the source code means that you can fix it. You can spot some kind of security vulnerability. You can report it, and it will be fixed. And on the other side, if you cannot see the source code, maybe there is a security issue, you don't know, and it will be more complicated to find it. So you know what they say about security, right? That security by obscurity is not security at all. So this is the same. If the source code is there, it's better for security, always. Another thing, it's about quality, right? People say, okay, open source has worse quality. Well, I've been working a lot of time in open source projects, in proprietary projects for customers, and I've seen good developers and not good developers in both sides. So the fact is that if you are not a very good developer and you do open source code, it's there, so anyone can see it, and maybe some folks will say, okay, this is bad, or this hasn't had good quality. But I also been working at different teams, and I've seen a lot of code, proprietary code for a lot of companies, and I've seen that that code is bad. It's worse, it has worse quality. So it depends on the team, it depends on the people that are developing the tools or the software. It's not about being open source. And the last myth is about developers. So someone says that if you make your software open source, you will have a line of developers willing to help you and contributing to new features. And maybe that's the case. I mean, if you do something that help people and you open source it, maybe some people will want to contribute to that tool or to that library or whatever. But on the other side, if you make something open source that it's only for you and only solves a small specific problem that you have, no one will use it, no one will care about it, so you won't have a lot of developers willing to help you. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of open source, because I think it's important to know how do we get where we are now. I'm pretty sure that all of you know this guy. He is Mr. Richard Stallman, and I want to share a little bit about his history because it's great. So Stallman started in 1971 working at the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at the MIT. And by that time, there was a bunch of developers. They called themselves hackers, and they like to share snippets of code, just like chefs. And by that time, they had very big printers, not like the ones we have now that are small, that we can connect with USB, with Wi-Fi connection. Those were very big printers, and they were in another room, in another building. So you need to print something and walk 5 minutes to another room to get your job printed. So what they did was modifying the source code of the printer driver, and every time that they submit something that was printed, they get a notification, so they could now walk 5 minutes to get the printed. And what happened in 1980 was that they bought a new computer, a new Xerox printer, and what happened was that Xerox didn't provide them the source code of the driver, so they couldn't modify it to get all this notification system in place. And what happened was that basically Stallman gets angry about all these things, about not being able to modify the source code, and he gets convinced that people should be able to modify the software they use. So a few years later, in 1984, Stallman left the MIT and started working full-time on the GNU project. And the GNU project wanted to give users the freedom and control of their software, of their computers, with the 4 famous freedoms of the open source. The first one is that you can use the software for any purpose, meaning that maybe when I developed something, I was thinking about one particular use case, but you can use it any way you want in any other different way. The second freedom is that you can share it. You are allowed to copy and distribute that software. The third one is that you can study the software, how it works, so you can change it so it does what it does as you wish. And the last one is that you are allowed to redistribute those modifications so you can help your neighbor. Right? And these 4 freedoms are guaranteed legally by the licenses that we will talk in a few minutes. And 1 year later, in 1985, Stallman creates the Free Software Foundation to help to achieve all these freedoms. Another really important person, for me, he's one of the most influential person in the open source movement, along with Stallman, is Linus Torvalds, the creator of the Linux kernel. Because Stallman already had started to create some tools, the GCC compiler, Bash, Emacs, and he wanted to create an open source kernel. But then, in 1991, everything changed. This is the famous message that Linus posted on the Minix forum. The bolts are mine. So Minix was a free operating system designed by Tannenbaum to teach students operating system designs. And he posted this message. It was August 1991. I'm going to read the bolts. So I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby, won't be as big as professional as GNU, for 3xx and 4xx clones. The message ends with, yes, it's free of any Minix code, and it has a multi-threaded file system. It's not portable, and it probably never will support anything other than 80 hard disk, and that's all what they have. And how grown was Linux by that time, right? Because I already knew that message, but I didn't realize about the date of the message. I started studying at college my computer science degree in 1997, so 6 years later after this message. And I remember that just 2, 3, maybe 4 years before starting at college, I was playing with Linux at home in my computer. So it's amazing all the things that Linux achieved with the Linux kernel in just a few years, right? And for me, the Linux kernel, it's probably one of the biggest examples of open source software success. A lot of developers working around the world in this very, very big code base, distributed everywhere. So it's a big achievement and success for the open source. And I have a few stats for you. So these are the lines of code of the Linux kernel. You can see that in the latest version, there are around 20 million lines of code. And when you have the source code, people like to make or try to find some nice or different stats. So these are the bad words in the kernel source code. I'm not going to read them. But as you can see, they are not that much, around less than 200, 150. But you can also see that there are very good words in the source code, like love, good, sweet, nice, more than 4K of good, 1,500 good, nice. So people, Linux kernel developers tend to write very good comments instead of really bad words, right? And then we all remember the good old Sun microsystems, right? At least people older enough. And they released Java 1.0 in 1995, but it was closed and proprietary source. But then, in 2006, they created the OpenJDK to be the free and open source implementation of the Java platform. And this implementation is licensed under GPL version 2 with linking exception. We will talk a lot about this specific thing later. And the OpenJDK was initially based only for JDK 7, but it was backported to OpenJDK 6. And since then, a lot of companies has contributed to OpenJDK. So now we have Red Hat, Microsoft, Azure, IBM, even Apple. A lot of big companies are contributing to the OpenJDK. Because OpenJDK is the official reference implementation for the Java platform. And basically, it's also maintained by some Oracle developers. And the Oracle JDK, it's just built on top of the OpenJDK, and they add some proprietary things on top of that. So for example, they provide now this Java Mission Control, which is some kind of profiler. But they announced just, I think it was last week, that they are going to open source that thing. So I think for Java 11 or maybe Java 12, the source mission control will be included in the OpenJDK. So they are moving a lot of things now from the proprietary Oracle JDK to the OpenJDK, which is really, really good for the community. Sorry. And then in November 2014, we saw something like this: Microsoft.NET for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. So the full .NET server stack, ASP.NET, the compiler, the core runtime, frameworks, libraries, are now open source. And this, coming from a company like Microsoft, was a really, really huge step for the community, right? Because traditionally, Microsoft hasn't been really, really involved in the open source. So they did this in November 2014. And then a few months later, in March 2015, they announced it. He is Satya Nadella, he is Microsoft CEO, and in one of conference he put that slide, Microsoft loves Linux, which was kind of shocking because, as you know, all the past about Microsoft and open source now, and they put that slide a few months later after they released all the .NET thing as open source. So for me, this is my personal opinion. It's just a strategy. I mean, Microsoft is a company, they need to make money. And they need to compete with AWS, with Amazon AWS, and with Google Cloud, because to be honest, no one uses Windows on production. I mean, maybe some folks deploy something on Windows on production, but the rest of us, we use some kind of Linux or something like that. So they need to compete with them. But even with that, and I know that also they contribute a lot to different projects. So for example, they contribute a lot to the Linux kernel. And they also have announced a month ago that its own Linux kernel for Azure. But I said, this is my personal opinion. I have really strong feelings about this because I live in a time in which Microsoft was the real evil, with saying something like everything is closed. I'm going to force you to use my browser, which is really bad, and it's part of my operating system, and you can get rid of it, right? So that's the time I lived. But even with all that stuff, I know that this is huge for the community. This is huge for the open source community, right? And now, as I said, everyone puts their software on production on some kind of Linux, and this has been even reinforced with something like Docker. We use nowadays these containers things. I'm not going to talk that much about things. All of you know about Docker probably. But basically, we can put anything we want inside this container, this box. We can run everything, every technology, every language, framework, tool, platform, whatever we want. If I want to try a new language, I can just install a Docker container with PHP, Java, JavaScript, .NET. I can put a Postgres server, Redis, Mongo, anything I want. There is a Docker container for it. And you can deploy it. And you don't need to worry about if you are using now Windows, Mac, or Linux for developing that thing. And Docker is also open source. They have some kind of proprietary things, but most of the code it's open source. And now let's talk a little bit about licenses. Remember, licenses guaranteed the open source for freedoms. And I'm not an expert on licenses, and I'm only going to talk a little bit about it. So basically, there are two kinds of licenses, the permissive ones and the vitals. And every time we talk about licenses, we need to think in two sides. One is me as the developer of some tool that I license as open source, and the other side is you as the users of that library. So the permissive ones are like the BSD or Apache, and basically, when I release something as Apache do, for example, and you use it, you are not forced to do basically anything. You can use that software any way you want, and you are not forced to do anything. So most frameworks and libraries or languages are, or at least quite a few of them, are licensed like this. For example, Grails, it's Apache 2. Spring Framework is Apache 2. The Groovy language is Apache 2. Now it's called Apache Groovy. Because you don't have any strings attached. You can use it any way you want. And on the other side, we have the vitals, like the GPL or the affair GPL, and they are called vitals because they infect the software they touch. Basically, if you are developing something and you use a GPL library, this library infects your software, and you now are forced to comply the GPL and release the source code if you are asked. Remember the Tesla in the second slide? Tesla is using open source, and Tesla was using some kind of GPL things, and after 3 years, they finally released their software as open source because they were forced to do that because of the license. And also remember about the OpenJDK. As I said, it's licensed with GPL version 2 with linking exception. That linking exception means that we can use that library from our source code, and we have the exception to comply the library. So without that exception, all the code that we develop with Java needs to be or should be open source under the GPL version 2. But with that linking exception, we can use Java, and we are not forced to comply that license. So I have a story about this. So the Greek mythology has this story about Ulysses and the pact he made with his men as they approached the Sirens, the Ulysses Pact. Because Ulysses wanted to hear the siren song, but he knew that doing that will render him incapable of rational thought, right? So what he did was he put wax on his men's ears so they couldn't hear the song, and had them tied into the mast so he could not jump into the sea. And he ordered them not to change the course under any circumstances, and even tied him even harder if they tried to escape from his bonds. So at the end, he could listen to the siren song without dying. And licenses are just like the Ulysses Pact. Every time you license something as open source, you are making a pact with your users, because that license makes sure that that software can't be changed, at least outside the terms of the license and in the future. So not even that software can be changed, not even by your boss or even by our investors. Will say, okay, here you have $300 million US to do this thing proprietary source, and you can't because of the license. And even by you in a moment of weakness, right? You can even change it, like Ulysses throwing to the sea. And now I want to share with you different kinds of ways to contribute to open source, because we are used to hear this term, I contribute to open source, and I think that when you think about contributing to open source project, you think about contributing with code, right? Because this is probably the most important one, and it's the most common one. And in the last 5 or 7 years, its popularity has been increased because the usage of GitHub. Everyone in this room has a GitHub account, and all the major libraries, tools, frameworks are on GitHub. But sadly and ironically, GitHub is not open source. So we put a lot of open source software in a platform that is not open source. And there are alternatives, like, for example, GitLab, which it's way too better than GitHub. It provides way more features, and it's open source. But in any case, contributing with code, it's one of the most important ways to contribute. An open source project really need it, because when you think how open source projects are maintained, you may think something like this. The validation flow, blah, 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 I've assigned to a team, let's going to ship it. So a lot of people, probably not in the same room, but a lot of people working on that particular library or tool, right? But actually, it's not like that. Open source projects are really maintained like this. It's 3 a.m. in the morning, you are alone on your office, on your room, at home, and you say something, okay, let's fix one more bug before going to bed, right? That's why it's really important to have contributions about code. But there are more ways to contribute to open source, and maybe some people are not aware of them. So imagine that you are using a library, or you want to use a library. You are reading the documentation, and you find a typo. You have 2 options. You can continue reading the documentation as nothing happened, or better, you can fix the typo and submit a pull request. And with something as simple as that, you are already contributing to open source. And this is a kind of contributions that maintainers love. So for your information, fixing a typo is a great way to learn how to contribute to open source software, and maintainers love these kind of contributions, because it's great to get started into how to contribute to open source. And also keep in mind that most of us are non-English native speakers. So maybe when I write some kind of documentation, I do my best, but sometimes I write something that is not really good, or maybe if you read it, you think, okay, maybe I can write this the other way and it will be better. So if you are in that position, please do it. Write it better and submit a pull request to fix that sentence or that documentation. And what about writing or improving the documentation? So let's be honest. We are developers, so don't fool ourselves. Who in this room like to write documentation? Can you please raise your hands? 4, 5? Okay, those 5 of you that raise your hand can now leave the room, okay? Just kidding. Because we are developers, we love to code, but we don't love to document, right? We know that it's important to write documentation because if a feature is there and it's not documented, it doesn't exist. When I evaluate in a tool or a library, I take a look at the documentation to see if that library works for me. And I'm not going to read the source code to try to figure out if that feature is there. I'm going to take a look at the documentation. So it's important to document everything. And I have a real-world example for you. So some time ago, a new feature was merged into the Groovy master branch, this macro Groovy thing. And the documentation wasn't really good, but it was master branch, development branch, so let's merge it. And what happened was that my former colleague, Mario Garcia, wanted to learn about this new feature. So he started digging into the documentation, or the real small documentation, into the source code, trying to figure out how this thing works. And in the meantime, he was writing documentation about how it works. So after some discussions on GitHub, all of this documentation was merged. So as you can see, more than 100 comments on the GitHub pull request, and more than 800 lines of documentation was merged. And this pull request wasn't also good for Groovy, for the Groovy language. It's also really good for him, for Mario, because he learned a lot while documenting the thing. And he also gave a talk at our local Groovy user group in Madrid about this new feature. So everyone, the Groovy language, the rest of the community, our local community, benefit from this kind of contribution. And what about bugs? So when you are using some library, you may find something that is not working, right? So you can blame the creators. We all do, right? We are humans. So when something is not working, we tend to blame. But it's even better if we also open a bug, right? And when you do that, please try to be constructive and try to provide as much information as you can. So if you open an issue, a bug saying, this doesn't work, please fix it. That's not helpful. No one can fix it. What's failing? I don't know, I need more information, right? So we don't like, as maintainers, we don't like to receive emails reporting saying, okay, there is a bug here. But it's good. I mean, I maintain a Grails plugin to use Postgres native types in Grails domain classes. And one day I received an issue with a bug that I wasn't able to reproduce. So what I did was I asked that user can you please provide a sample project to reproduce the issue? And that user created this amazing sample project, right? This is all the user wrote to reproduce the issue with all the steps one after the other. So with this kind of issue report, I was able to fix that issue. I was able to reproduce it on my local laptop. And I was able to release a new version of the software that fixed that issue, right? So as maintainers, if someone took time to write something like this, because you can't write something like this in 5 minutes, right? It's not working, hit enter, right? It takes something like probably 30 minutes or even an hour to write some kind of report like this. The first thing you need to say is be polite and thank that guy or that person, right? Because it's nothing, but saying thank you, it's really simple for you, and on the other side, it's well received, right? And also try to be kind as much as you can. And do you remember how open source projects are maintained? Check the date, Christmas Eve, right? Because it's Christmas Eve, it's holiday, you don't need to work, you have a few hours in the morning before going to your parents or your in-laws to have dinner. So what you can do? Contributing to open source. This is how it's maintained, right? And what about the community? Another way to contribute to open source, it's with community. It's talking about the project, about the library, about something that you are passionate about. And you don't need to be an expert to give a talk on something you know. Maybe if giving a talk at a conference like this one is too much for you at the beginning, you can start smaller. You can talk with your colleagues at your company, 5, 6, 7 of your colleagues. Or you can go to a local meetup. I don't know about Riga, but in Madrid, there are a lot of meetups. Every day in the week, there is meetups about anything. So you have plenty of options to choose if you want to learn or if you want to share anything. And if you are looking for a specific meetup and it's not there, just create one. That's all that you need, right? So now in this part, I've convinced you to try to contribute to open source or do some open source, but how do I start? So what I'm going to share with you now, it's my personal story. And I'm also going to share another case for a friend. So what happened was that in December 2009, I wanted to change my career. I was working at a company that I didn't like, doing things that I didn't like. So what I did was I was trying to find a new job, and I joined a big IT company in Spain, something like 1,500 employees. But I joined a very specific department, the free and open source software department. We were a small department inside that big IT company, and we were special. We were the freaks in the company. We were the only people in that big company allowed to work from home a few days a week. And we wanted to do everything following open source principles. We use Linux. We truly believe in open source. And by that time, I started working in a project using the Grails framework. So Grails, it's a full-stack JVM framework for developing web applications. And when you use Grails, you need to use Groovy as the language, right? Groovy is a JVM language. I've been using Java for a long time, so Groovy is another language on the JVM. So I started using Groovy and Rails to develop web applications. And as we wanted, in this department, we wanted to have more flexibility to choose projects and to continue doing things following this open source philosophy. So what we did a few years later, all of us, the whole department, quit that big company, and we created Kaleidos because we wanted to do things different. We wanted to have the possibility to say, okay, I don't want to do that project. I don't mind it's a lot of money because I don't truly believe in that, or you are evil and you are something like that. So in Kaleidos, we now had the power to say, no, I'm not going to do this project. We want to do this right. We want to contribute to the community, to the world in some kind of different ways. And by that time, it was around July 2011, something like that, I started to assist to the Madrid Groovy user groups, our local group. And at the very beginning, we were something like 5, 7, 8 people. That's a really, really small group. And I wanted to have meetings every month because I learned a lot from that community, from that small community. I was using Groovy and Rails, so I wanted to learn more and more about the tool, the frameworks, and everything. And those people, those folks knew a lot about that, so I really wanted to have meetups every month. So without thinking too much, I was trying to push to have more talks every month, and I checked the dates. And in March 2013, I got the Twitter credential accounts, and I've been running Madrid Groovy user group for more than 5 years now. I try to keep the peace of the group. We have a lot of work, a lot of talks. We record all the talks. They are all in our YouTube channel. They are in Spanish. Sorry about that. We have more than 40 talks recorded, and now the group has grown a lot. We are in every meeting. We have around 30, 40, 50. A couple of times we were around 80 people. That was really, really huge for us. And around those years, I also went as the first Glitch edition. Glitch is a Groovy conference in Spain, in Madrid. Everything is in English. And I went there in November 2011 as an attendee, the first year. I really liked that conference. I learned a lot about Groovy, about Grails. I met a lot of contributors in this area. And I wanted to go there. I gave a talk the second year, and for the third year, the organizer, Alberto, was a little bit tired because he was the only organizer of the conference, right? So Glitch is not a big conference like this one. So the first edition was 150 attendees, something like that. But it was too much work for only one person. So I was talking to Alberto, and I said, I can help you. Please let me help you, because I wanted to continue having Glitch, because it's great. I've learned a lot, and I want to contribute. So we've been organizing Glitch since then, and last March was the 7th edition, and we are really happy about all the things that we've done. And another thing that I've done is giving talks at international conferences. So since late 2014, I've been doing quite a few talks. And when I was working at Kaleidos, we had a project in London. So sometimes I were in London, sometimes I was working at home, sometimes I was at a conference. So my colleagues started this kind of joke, #Iván on tour, because I was never at the office. So, and they didn't know, are you at a conference? Are you in London? Are you at home? I don't know, right? And they gave me this t-shirt. And giving talks at international conference, it's also a great way to contribute. So for me, it's a way to give something back to the community, because it's another way to share your knowledge. You know about anything? Okay, let's share it. You go to a conference and you talk about that thing that you know, you are passionate about, and you help people to understand or to get used to that tool or that technology, right? And more things about giving to international conference is that you don't need to pay for the ticket, right? When you're a speaker, you don't pay for the ticket. So if the ticket costs 400 euros, 500 euros, you have the ticket for free, and you can see all the amazing talks in that conference just for free. So it's awesome. And also, most of the conference covers your travel and accommodation, so you don't even need to pay to go to the conference. And the day before the conference, you have this speakers dinner, it's awesome. You met a lot of speakers, you talk to them, you are out of your comfort zone, and it's great. And you can also see new cities, do some tourism, stay there a few more days. So it's been great. So this has been my 2016 and 2017 tours. I've done a few talks at the conference, local groups, meetups. And the thing is that I'm not a developer advocate. I wasn't a developer advocate by that time, and I'm not now a developer advocate. So it's not my job to give talks at conference. I do it because I like it, right? But I know that there are speakers in this conference. Philip is one of them, and this is his schedule for only just 3-4 weeks, right? So developer advocates like Philip can give something like 25 talks in 15 cities in 3 weeks, right? So much more than what I did in the past 3 years, right? But that's his job, and it's not my job, right? So for me, doing something like this, giving to 6-7 conferences, different countries, and something like that, has been awesome. So in the meantime, while I was doing that, I was also contributing to different open source projects. I sent pull requests to the Grails framework. I give talks, organize meetups, organize greets. So finally, what happened was that in August 2016, I was hired by Object Computing. So OCI, it's the company that now is sponsoring the development of the Grails framework, and also the Micronaut framework that we just released the first milestone 2 days ago. So now I'm a Grails committer, and I'm being paid to work almost full-time on open source, which is kind of amazing. So after using the framework for more than 8 years as a developer, as a user, right, using the framework to create web applications for clients or for customers, I'm now part of the team that is developing the framework. And this is my desktop. I work from home for a US company. I work remotely. And this is great. So when I explain this to some people, they usually say something like, oh, how lucky you are that you work from home, you work remotely, and you are paid to work on open source software, right? So let me tell you something. That was not luck, right? I was lucky that my father bought me a computer when I was 6, when I was 7. But the rest, you have heard my story in these last 10 minutes. So it wasn't luck, at least not all of it, right? So maybe I was in the right place at the right time. But I've been doing a lot of things that I wasn't thinking about this being hired by OCI when I was doing all the things, right? I didn't know OCI 4 years ago. But the good news is that you can also become an open source software developer if you want. And I have an example for you. So he's Jesus Espino. He's a former colleague at Kaleidos, and he has been involved in open source in a few years. And at one point in his career, he wanted to change, so he decided to contribute to projects that he really liked, or with technologies that he really wanted to learn. So every day after he finished his regular work, he spent the evenings and the weekends sending small contributions to different projects. And what happened was that after 3-4 months, he got a job offer to work full-time at Mattermost. So for those of you that don't know, Mattermost is a Slack open source clone. So now he's working full-time, contributing to Mattermost. He also has learned the Go language in all this way because he didn't know that much about Go. And now he's also working in open source. He's really happy about it. So if you want to start to contribute to some projects but you don't know where, you can check this repo. In this repo, there is a group by language. There are a lot of projects that has these kind of labels on GitHub that are easy for beginners or are really good first contribution. Are the maintainers of these projects really want to help you to get involved in their communities, right? So if you want to learn about JavaScript, about Erlang, Rust, Clojure, Scala, any language or anything you want to learn, check this repo and pick one of those repos, take a look at the issues, and the maintainers of those repos will help you to start contributing to open source, right? So yes, you can do it. I told you my story, but you can have your own. You can become an open source software developer if you want. This is what you really want. And maybe you can be here in this same room in a couple of years telling your story. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference. So thank you for a great